Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Friday, October the 27th. And welcome to our commentary. Well, I've got my Texas Rangers shirt on, and everybody's talking about the Texas Rangers around here. The World Series will begin tonight. This is a very interesting series for Rangers fans, and that's because we haven't been there in 12 years. The last time the Rangers were in the series was 2011. And what was interesting is we were in the series in 2010 and 2011. So the Rangers had back-to-back trips to the World Series. We didn't win them, unfortunately. We didn't win. In 2010, we lost to the Giants. By the way, the same Giants managed back then by Bruce Bochy, who's the Ranger manager now. And then in 2011 came the big heartbreak World Series, and that was against St. Louis, and that was the famous Game 6 where there was a fly ball to right field that should have been the last out of the inning, and it just didn't work out that way. So I think there's a lot of what you would call anxiety around here about playing in the World Series, but there's also a lot of excitement. Looking forward to again what could be a very exciting series. We're playing a team, the D-backs. This is a very different team than the Cardinals that we played years ago because at least we knew who the Cardinals were. They had a lot of players we knew. But the D-backs, nobody really knows them. That's one of the great mysteries of the D-backs this year. Nobody really knows this team. And I think as a consequence, you're playing a team that was not supposed to be here. You're playing a team that has upset three consecutive teams. They upset Milwaukee. They upset the Dodgers. That was a huge upset. And then, of course, they upset the Philadelphia Phillies in 7 games by winning Game 7 in Philadelphia. So, a lot of fans around here, we don't know who these backs are, these D-backs, Diamondbacks. We don't know who they are. And but yet we know that they're a pretty good team because they wouldn't be in the World Series. So there's a lot of that curiosity as to what's going to happen. I think the Rangers will win the series. But, again, we don't know. It's tough to bet against the D-backs considering how they got to the World Series. So all I can tell you is enjoy the series. It's going to be fun. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. You'll get to meet some new players from the D-backs. And I think a lot of the Rangers players are going to finally be on the national stage. This is for a lot of the Rangers players, this is going to be a new experience because we have not been that well known of a team. In fact, a lot of baseball fans knew very little about the stars on the Rangers team. So I think in that respect, both teams are similar in the sense that they are both exceeding the expectations that people had, not just at the beginning of the year, but even on Labor Day. I don't think a lot of people would have accepted the idea that the Rangers were going to be in the World Series, and certainly not the D-backs. On this day in history, this week in history was very consequential because back in 1962, we had something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war. We have never been closer to a nuclear war between the two superpowers. Back then, of course, it was called the Soviet Union and the U.S. And the world has never been closer to a nuclear attack than we were back then. So I got together with Barry Jacobson, who's a military historian, and we talked about this. We talked about, that crisis from a military standpoint. And I wanted you to hear this audio interview that I had with him several years ago. So he's my friend, Barry Jacobson, talking about that time this week in 1962. So check it out.
I agree with you 100%. Now, speaking of putting a man on the moon, John Kennedy, President Kennedy, is our on this day in history moment. It was exactly this week. Actually, I think it was October 23rd. Remember correctly from my reading that President Kennedy spoke to the nation about the missile crisis in Cuba. A lot of people have different takes on this. In the end, politically, it worked for President Kennedy in the sense that he gained a lot of reputation and all of that from this event. I happen to have a little bit different take. I still admire the work that President Kennedy did, but I think the reason he had to do what he did, meaning take the world to the brink of a nuclear war, is because he had projected so much weakness before in the Bay of Pigs and then in Vienna and overall, that I think the Soviets thought, we can push this guy around and put the missiles in Cuba. I don't think they would have put the missiles in Cuba if they really, really feared President Kennedy. So then Kennedy had to overreact and take the world to the brink of a nuclear war. I mean, that's my take on it without being too critical of President Kennedy, but that's how I feel.
Absolutely correct on that. Kennedy did project weakness early in his administration for the reasons you just stated. When Khrushchev met with Kennedy in Vienna, their first time meeting, Khrushchev came away saying that he was feeling that Kennedy was weak and could be moved around, could be pushed, and Kennedy felt he had been mugged by Khrushchev. It was one of the most terrible days of his life was the treatment he got at the hands of Khrushchev. And the funny thing is, this history is sort of repeating itself today with another weak president being pushed around by Russia for the same reasons. Russia feels that they can get away with it, at least the next 16 months. The audience needs to remember that this was the only time in history that we went to DEFCON 2, which means basically we are full state alert. The Air Force can be up and attacking within 6 hours. The next state is DEFCON 1, where you're what they call quick trigger. You're just ready to shoot at any time. And essentially a war. We never came any closer to nuclear war than we did on this anniversary back in 1962.
Yeah, it was really remarkable. Of course, I was a little boy in Cuba when all of this was happening. As I said before, I think at the end of the day, President Kennedy did it correctly and was able to get the missiles out of Cuba. My only regret is that he didn't tell the Soviets, okay, the missiles are going, and so is Fidel. Because I think if President Kennedy had put it that way to the Soviets, I think they would have said, okay, how would you like him to leave, dead or alive? Because one of the things that we've learned since the missile crisis is how angry the Soviets were with Castro and how angry Castro was with the Soviets. Castro actually wanted the Soviets to go to nuclear war over Cuba. Not only Castro, but Che Guevara, too. So, anyway, I mean, it's always easy to go back and say this or that. But that was I think another opportunity that Kennedy failed to take advantage of there.
Yes, he did. And of course, during the Bay of Pigs incident, his military advisors wanted to do everything from landing the 82nd Airborne in Cuba to massive airstrikes. But we were in a very strong position, which is why Khrushchev really backed down because he knew he couldn't win either a nuclear exchange or a conventional war against the United States. He had way more missiles than we had. He had a much larger military in every sense. Step one, which is the divisions were in Europe, he had more of those. NATO was, but not necessarily. And yet Khrushchev felt he could get away with it. And today we're in the same position. We have a massive military advantage over the Russians. And yet Putin, like Khrushchev, pushes hard and plays his hand well. And despite being weaker, he's able to play from a position of strength. I'm reminded that Alexander the Great famously said, he fears an army of sheep led by a lion more than he fears an army of lions led by a sheep. And we've become the nation of lions led by a sheep. And Putin is the reverse. And that's why we're having so much trouble. And we will continue until we change presidents.
Right.
And that's the conversation that I had with Barry Jacobson. Barry, again, a military historian. And I just had the audio of that conversation. But again, going back to this week in 1962, the missile crisis, and as Barry was saying on that interview, that was the closest we ever came to a nuclear war. But the way you keep these conflicts from happening, and we're seeing now the situation in the Middle East, where now yesterday, I guess, U.S. jets hit some targets in Syria, and you've got Iran talking about, going to war. The way you keep these conflicts from happening is basically to be tough from the beginning, for them to know that you're tougher than they are, and you will do things if they do things. And unfortunately, and I don't want to politicize the situation when you have American soldiers potentially fighting, but this Biden administration is not an administration that projects strength. And it all started really with the invasion of Afghanistan. I mean, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the way that was done. Unfortunately, President Biden doesn't project strength physically, as we can see from these conferences and so on. So we're in very dangerous times. And let's just hope that it all works out. But there's a lot of people out there who have been tempted to do things I don't believe they would have done. Had there been a stronger president in the White House. I just don't think that they would have. Just quickly, I have a post over at the American Thinker today talking about migration to the border and the kinds of money that people are paying to get to the U.S. border, $3,000, $5,000 to get on a plane. That's a lot of money for people in Cuba and in Haiti and many of these other places. So I don't know how they're getting that money. I'm pretty familiar with the situation in Cuba. I don't know how they get money like that in Cuba. So there's something going on behind all of this human trafficking. Either somebody's paying these trips or special arrangements are being made with these people to, hey, once you get to the U.S., you'll have to pay. I don't know what the arrangement is. I'm speculating, but that's a lot of money to get to the U.S. Mexico border. Speaking of Mexico, I remind you that I wrote a post a couple of days ago about insecurity in Mexico being the driving issue in the political campaign coming up. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll talk to you next. And go Rangers. That's all you can say. Go Rangers. I think it's going to be a great series. Bye-bye, everybody.